Are you concerned about your playgroup size? Studies show that over 52% of Magic players are self-conscious about their playgroup. Believe it or not, the average playgroup size is just 5, and most players don't actually care about the size of the pod. What really matters is how you play with it. If you do want to increase the size of your playgroup to 6, 8, or even more than 8, just use Lucky Paper's proven methods for playgroup enlargement. Grow your playgroup and discover better ways to play with it today.
Alright, ready to go? Yes. Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Lucky Paper Radio. I am Andy and I'm here as always with my co-host, Anthony, Charge Shot Enjoyer Maddox.
I do like a charge shot. I'm not very good at Super Smash Brothers, but I do really, it's very satisfying to me to, sneak off in a little corner and get my charge shot fully charged.
You thrive in group settings because everyone else is very aggressive and, they got a blood craze in their eyes, right? Mm-hmm. They're playing Smash because they're trying to spike their friends, and you just kind of sneak off to a little corner and just start throwing projectiles, charging up charge shots.
Yep, in Super Smash Brothers and in life, being just two people is really, it puts you on the spot. It's nicer to go charge up your charge shots and shoot missiles or go in the kitchen and cook something.
I was going to say, how does that translate to real life? What's the metaphor you're working with here?
Mm-hmm. That was it.
Just going off to the kitchen and cooking something
Pretty
is the
much,
equivalent of going off and doing a charge shot?
It's often it's often less intimidating to be in a group setting, I find.
I guess that would count if you came out of the kitchen and hurled all the food you just cooked at your guests.
Here's a pizza to the face.
Enjoy this focaccia. What would the remote bombs be?
No, we're sticking with the charge shot. I think a big bread is perfect because, you go in the kitchen, it rises in a big dough ball.
I should have mentioned textured Yoshi. That would have made for more interesting because you also enjoy textured Yoshi.
Yeah, I like to try different characters. Regular Yoshi, textured Yoshi.
You don't like regular Yoshi at all. You only like textured
Yoshi. It's great.
Did you know in an earlier Smash iteration, textured Yoshi was even more textured?
Oh, really?
He was like...
Oh, because he was like not a
knitted.
Not a terry cloth, but more of a burlap kind of texture.
Oh, he was like, what's the thing that's knitting but three-dimensional?
Crochet?
He was crocheted.
Okay.
He was a big crocheted Yoshi.
Anyway, my Super Smash Brothers 2023 goal is I want to get really good with Lucas. Is that weird? I just want to be able to shoot myself with lightning bolts and punch people with my head.
Look, I just love that you have a 2023 Smash goal. I don't care what it is.
Great.
That excites me tremendously.
Putting that on my list right now.
This is not a Super Smash Brothers podcast, though. Although maybe it should be sometimes.
Huh.
Maybe bonus episodes or something. This is instead a podcast about Magic the Gathering. Specifically, this week we're talking about how to draft cubes with smaller groups of people. I think one of the biggest barriers to most people playing Cube, Anthony, is that a lot of people have the misconception that you have to have 8 people all together to draft it in order for it to work, and that's really hard to do, so a lot of people think having a cube is too hard, I won't even try.
Yeah, a big part of what we talked about last week on the episode where we talked all about growing a cube group was a lot of times you're going to have weird numbers and you got to sort of be prepared to figure out how to play games and keep people entertained so that they'll come back and play cube again. So
do a little dance. We dance for them.
Keep them happy. So this week we just want to talk about all of those ways to actually make that work in practice, as well as just talk about, how to have fun with your cube all the time because, you just don't necessarily always have a group of 8 people.
Now I'm picturing you like on the roller coaster with your cube buckled in and you're like, going over the
Me
hill
and my
and
cube
going,
having
wee!
a good time montage.
You're skipping through the field with a picnic basket. What else? What else could you do with your cube? Oh, you're at a horror movie and you cover your eyes and go, the cube's next to you in the window.
Puts its arm around me.
Yeah.
And it's like, where the did that arm come from? Sorry.
Don't worry, I got the bleep button. That'll work just fine. I think, Anthony, we should start by talking about an 8-player draft. Why is this the presumed default that everybody thinks of when they think of a booster draft or when they think of a cube draft?
Great question. Well, in 1993, Richard Garfield invented Magic the Gathering, and at the time they had baseball cards, which came in packs of 15, and that's why forever we have booster cards in packs of 15 cards forever.
What does that have to do with an 8-player draft at all?
That's where we're starting, because that's why 8-player drafts start with packs of 15. I guess there were actually 12 or 13 or something.
Yeah,
but
it wasn't 15 either. Yeah, also, it doesn't... That's like saying, the story begins back when the ancient Egyptians invented papyrus.
Oh, you want to go all the way back there? Yeah, let's do it.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, the assumption of an 8-player cube draft is inherited from Retail Limited, from regular retail draft, which, if you go to an event, is run with 8 people typically. And the reason that's not, I think it's worth acknowledging, is mostly for matchmaking. I think if you have 8 people, you get to do 3 clean rounds. It, takes a certain amount of time and you have a clear winner. If you had, just 4 people in 2 rounds, it's a little bit less exciting. The winner only beat 2 people. They've earned it a little less. And if you have more people than that, it becomes, way more time consuming to possibly do a full group. So 8 is a nice clean number for a clean bracket. Assuming everybody has wins and losses in each round, you can have a clear winner, or clear loser, and a bunch of people in between.
Yeah, it works out really well. I mean, 8 players is just a great fit for that reason. I think, as I'm trying to joke a little bit, a lot of the things that go into why a draft works the way it works are a little bit arbitrary, right? It is just because of historical reasons that's what happened to work, but it all does hang together pretty well. The fact that 3 rounds is a good chunk of time, but, it's an evening or an afternoon. It's not a whole day, so it ends up being a nice sort of tournament length. The fact that 3 15-card packs ends up giving you a deck size of about 40, which means you end up seeing most of your deck after a couple games. Like, all of that just works out pretty well. You're not doing a bunch of extra drafting for cards you don't end up seeing in your games, or running out of cards a lot of times.
Well, again, that pack size thing doesn't... You could draft with 50 people or 3 people, and you're still going to have 45 cards.
I'm just talking about the whole sort of draft structure, because I think we are going to talk about how you can digress from that base draft structure.
Oh, baby, we're going to digress.
It does work for a lot of reasons, and especially with 8 players.
I also think that the 8-player draft has subtly, in a lot of ways, informed what people perceive to be like normal cube design. The number of archetypes you can have in your cube, the density of fixing you should have in your cube. I think most people, whether they realize it or not, probably have a lot of these ideas baked in around an assumption of an 8-player draft. I'm not even sure I can describe exactly how, but that feels like that's what people are thinking of abstractly in their head when they're designing their cube. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that people I even see call out will say I will sometimes draft this with some of these other ways, but really that key idea, the core assumption is the way that this is meant to be played is with 8 players, 3 packs of 15, and anything that is, needs to be mentioned is what is different from that.
Yeah.
And I agree, a lot of sort of assumptions get baked in about, we expect to see players playing a certain number of colors, or just sort of the texture of how often you're going to see certain combinations of cards together. All of that, when you're evaluating a cube, is often in that specific context of that kind of draft.
Something I think is interesting is that if you presume mostly 2-colored decks, which is pretty typical for retail limited, maybe less typical for cubes. I think cubes tend to maybe lean a little more multicolored than just having mostly 2-colored decks. But, there are 10 guilds and 8 drafters, which is interesting. Those numbers are different. So, theoretically, in most drafts, you're going to have 2 guilds that are just not drafted or kind of ignored. And that tension between the fact that you're not going to cleanly fall into one of these clear guilds, I think contributes to the way that a draft feels and contributes to the way people design their cubes.
Yeah, I think that asymmetry is actually a positive effect, that you don't just end up saying yep, we've unshuffled it. There are going to be these irregularities and differences from draft to draft because things are going to break down differently. I mean, I think even just think that, choosing odd numbers and prime numbers is something that comes up a lot in games because you do want to sort of inject those kinds of asymmetries, these things that don't line up together, to create those kinds of interesting changes. Just break it down even to the 5 colors of Magic. I think 5 makes so much more sense than 4 or 6 for that particular aspect of the game.
5 just feels right.
Yeah. There's obviously a lot of familiarity bias because we've been playing this game for a long time and we've always had 5 colors, but I think if we had gone back and started from scratch, it still would make a lot of sense.
Yeah. So if prime numbers are the best, we should obviously be drafting in pods of 13 with packs of 17, right?
Sure, yeah. For some reason that relates to cryptography and data encoding too, right?
I guess.
Mm-hmm. Cool, great.
Yeah, sure. I don't think the small prime numbers are that important with regards to cryptography.
You start with the small primes, then you get bigger as you need.
Okay. So if you are able to draft with 8 people, chances are that most cubes out there are designed to support that, because I think it is very oftentimes the presumed default. I think the 8-player, 15-card draft format works great, and I don't think there's any reason to really diverge from it, especially because, as we'll talk about all these other different ways you can possibly draft, it's worth noting that every step you take further away from quote-unquote normal Magic is another kind of step you're asking your drafters to take, and a little bit of you asking them to trust you that it's going to still be fun and that it's not going to totally fall apart. So trying to minimize the number of modifications, I think, is always good. So with 8 people, I see no reason to not just do 3x15.
Yeah, absolutely. But it is hard to do that. I thought it was a really funny comment one of our players noted a couple weeks ago at our Cube night that having an activity that's mod 8 is a difficult event to run. And I thought it was really funny that everybody around was just like, yeah, I totally know exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
Because
true.
we're a bunch of nerds. But, an activity that requires an even number of groupings of 8, that is like very weird in the scope of activities, of hobbies that you can have to play with your friends.
Yeah. The one somewhat common, I guess, adjustment I've seen to an 8-player draft is there are a lot of people that draft their cube with more cards in the pack. I see 16 more often than any other number other than 15. People tend to like 16 because it's a multiple of the number of people around the table, so everybody gets 2 cards out of every pack, which I think feels more symmetrical to some people. And also that extra slot just means you can make all the decks in your cube more powerful just by giving them more of everything, so they have more stuff to choose from. But beyond that, I think 8 players is the most clear number of people. If you have 8, easy peasy, fire up a draft. Working down, I think we should do even-numbered combinations, Anthony, and then maybe at the end talk about how to handle odd numbers, which I think you can go either direction, right? You can go up or down and then think about how to handle that by. But to me, I think the next big number is 6 players, and I have come to think of 6 players as just as fun and complete and totally full as an 8-player draft and not at all compromised by team drafting.
Yeah, I actually like team draft a lot for, I think the biggest reason that you're going to mention is that it just makes the pairings really easy. So the way that you do a team draft is you manage everything the same way as a normal 8-player pod, except before the draft, or after, as some groups do it, you figure out what teams people are going to be on. Usually you alternate, team A, team B.
Around the table.
And then you draft as normal, you play as normal. The only big difference is the way you do pairings, which is you play each of the other 3 people on the opposing team, and then you win or lose on your team record, which just means that unlike an 8-player draft where you have this clean 3-tiered round structure where you can figure out who the winner is, you have another clean way, because otherwise you're going to have to pair people up or down, not necessarily have winners play against winners and losers play against losers if you had 6 players trying to do a normal tournament structure.
And that pairing up or down can be a real feel bad for people.
Yeah.
Like if you played round 1 and you lost, you feel bad about your deck, and then you get paired up against somebody else that won and you lose again, you're going to feel kind of bad. Like the regular round structure is nice because it does pair people with a similar record, which means they're more likely to have a reasonable game of Magic, even if there are different levels of experience at the table or whatever. So especially as the Cube host, I think you should be wary of any format that requires you to pair up or down, because it does open up a potential for even more like, I got unlucky, and then I got further unlucky by having to play the really good player with a really good deck and got stomped.
Or, you get paired up, but then you end up beating that player. It's like, oh, well, what do we do now? We're in this kind of like awkward situation where the tournament doesn't really
it never
work.
breaks down really nicely, and that is by far the biggest virtue of Team Draft when it comes to Cube. In the context of Retail Limited, Team Draft can take on a more interesting texture because it is zero-sum. And we've talked about this in the show a while ago, and other people have talked about this as well on other podcasts and YouTube channels and whatnot, but because you're winning or losing based on your team record, unlike a regular person draft, in a team draft, theoretically, you are more incentivized to make a hate draft something from your opponent if you can figure out what colors they're on, because you don't want their deck to be good. If their deck is good, then they're going to beat you and your teammates, and that's bad for you. Whereas in a normal 8-player draft, hating on one player you're passing to is never worth it, because the chances you end up playing them are very slim, and so you're making your deck worse in exchange for making one other player at the table's deck worse, but you have 6 other matches that you could potentially be playing. So those things kind of do change in Retail Limited. I will say the more we have team drafted in the context of Cube, the more I'm convinced that this element is basically not present in most team drafts of Cubes because of the flattened power level.
Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't, of course, generalize about Cube. There are all kinds of cubes, and some that might have a really wide power level, and those might still apply, but a lot that we are playing have pretty narrow power bands, so you're not necessarily playing this zero-sum game of saying, oh, I'm going to take this rare even though it's not for my deck, just because I don't want the opposing team to have it. It's also just so much harder to evaluate what the person next to you is actually doing.
That's the bigger thing for me, honestly. Like, yeah, so say you're drafting Brothers War, and you open a pack that has a total bomb rare like Titania's Command, but also a really, really good removal spell that's clearly the next best card in the pack. When you pass that pack to the left, you can reasonably assume that the person's going to take that removal spell, or take that, A spell when you would take the A+ spell. And because of that, you can start to have a more clear idea of what colors they might be in. I've found that, we've played a lot of different cubes through our vast local playgroup, through CubeCon, through playing cubes online. I've never seen a cube that has that kind of power delta where the packs will very clearly have one card that is like multiple tiers better than any other card, which is what incentivizes you to hate pick, and it's also what informs your knowledge of what the people around you are drafting, which can even tell you what to hate pick. So with those two additional complexities on top of it, that it's much harder to know what the person you're passing to is playing, and also the hate pick is oftentimes not even going to be that much worth it, because how much worse is the next best card in the pack than the card you're hating from them? You know, you're not taking the Cityscape Leveler. Well, you just play that in your deck. You're not taking the Gix's Command from your opponent and they're getting stuck with some like C- playable in response. You're taking the Gix's Command and they're going to get A- instead of an A for their deck. So I really like when we're approaching team draft with Cube, just thinking about it as like a normal draft. And I think it's totally reasonable, and it's also really helpful when you're explaining to new players, because we do have a lot of new players drafting our cubes, and when you're like, we're going to do a team draft, there's always that moment of like, oh, what's that? I don't know what that is. And it's like, don't worry. You're just going to draft
just ignore it.
Normal. Don't sweat that at all, and then you're actually going to have help during your deck construction and during gameplay potentially, which is a way to make the sort of games more fun and dynamic. It means you don't check out completely after your match is over waiting for the round to end, because you're invested in the outcome of other matches.
Yeah, totally. I think there are a ton of knock-on effects that really work well about a team draft, in addition to just making the pairings easier. I think it also just makes pairings easier from a logistical standpoint, just thinking, not having to figure out who's being paired with who, but just we're going to play the person across the table, and then we're all just going to, one side's going to scoot down one seat and do that 3 times, is just really nice and easy if you're trying to organize the draft. You don't want to worry too much about pairings. It's also a lot of fun to be able to like talk through your deck building,
especially as a cube designer.
And I think again, building off of what we were talking about last week about growing your cube group, if you have people of sort of different mixed skill levels, it's a really great way to actually motivate people to help each other, and not just say, well, I'm helping my potential opponents that's like suboptimal. No, you're actually on the team with someone else who's maybe of a different skill level. So
yeah, it's funny to say it, but like, in every other kind of Magic, nobody at the table ever wants you to win.
Yeah.
So, which is not that fun, right? Like,
at least from a gameplay perspective, in like their world of trying to optimize it. But this actually motivates you to try and help each other.
Right.
To clarify that about the rules, again, it's normal games in Magic. You're building your deck out of your own pool, but you
have no additional information when drafting. You cannot help your teammates
Correct.
in any way when drafting, so you draft normally.
But you can help each other build decks from the pools, make choices, as well as help with mulligan decisions or difficult play points. So I think all of that sort of team camaraderie really goes a long way to making it a fun night of Cube. So I think it's great if you have 6 players. You can even make it work if you have larger groups, but again, we're sort of talking about optimizing each number of players, and so I think that they're great. I'm always happy when we have a 6 pod these days.
Yeah, I honestly, like, team draft is such a great solution for 6 people that I don't even think about any alternatives. Like, it's so much better than the next thing you can do with 6 people that I'm not even sweating the other options.
Yeah, I mean, because you can, of course, just do a normal draft with normal packs and do that round structure where you have people paired up and paired down. That also works fine, too, if you prefer that.
We didn't say it, but team draft tends to be with the same 3x15 card packs. 6 people is less than 8. It does change the number of cards you get out of each pack and how the wheels work slightly. I don't think it's a drastic enough change that it's worth making an adjustment there. I think you could make an argument that 4x11 packs would be better for 6 players, because you would see the same amount of wheels of a given pack as you see in a 15-card pack at an 8-player table. But that's another example of like that change being another thing you have to tell people about, and another modification, and how much are you really getting out of it. I think team draft is totally fine with just 15-card packs.
Yep, works great.
Should we mention team sealed? Does anyone play sealed with their cubes?
I think we should absolutely mention team sealed. I actually think that sealed, unless you're really building the environment for it, and neither of us have done that in a really complete way yet.
No, at all. Yeah. We've like theory crafted it. None of us have put paper to paper about.
But we have talked about some of the challenges where, because Cube often has these really distinct synergies, you have your Wrath of Gods on one end of the spectrum and your Goblin Guides, or, your hyper aggro cards that I'm sure I could give much more up-to-date examples of that don't necessarily fit in the same deck. It can be difficult to build sealed pools from a lot of cubes, but if you're doing team sealed, where you're building multiple pools or multiple decks from a much larger pool, I think you do have the flexibility of splitting up those cards. So I think actually doing, 2 teams of 3, you get a much larger pool. We don't need to go into too many of the details. We have a lot of these formats explained, specific card counts and the specific processes on our website, which you should go check out.
Yeah, podcasts are not good reference material. No one's going to be scrubbing through this saying, what number did they say? Like, we're going to write this all down so you don't have to listen back to it.
So go figure out, because I know it off the top of my head. I'm just not going to tell you right now what that large number of cards to start with for Team Sealed is.
135.
135 cards.
It's actually 180 cards by the official rules of team sealed, 4 packs per player of a 3-player team. I think that's a lot in the context of Cube, but that is what regular team sealed is.
And build out 3 separate decks from it, and then, yeah, you can do a similar sort of round robin against your opponents. I think that is a really fun way to play a Cube. If you want the sort of longer deck building time, I think, again, that works maybe even better with a group of mixed skill level because you get to even more help each other figure out how to optimize your decks.
And I'm not sure if the deck building time is going to be longer given that you have no draft at all.
Great point.
And I would say that I think most Magic players I've talked to, drafting is one of the most fun parts of playing Magic. So even if you could just draft multiple times and never play matches, some players would be very happy with that. So I think for most groups, this is probably going to be kind of a hard sell. I do think that in the times we've talked about the kinds of design decisions that would make sense for a environment that's focused on sealed, where I think you could have, for example, more committal bomb cards, like include cards that are many steps above the power level, but that require some commitment, and then your players get to decide in the deck building if that's a compromise they want to make, building around this powerful card to get its benefit versus not because they want to play more generically powerful stuff. We've talked about some of those considerations. I think those same considerations would be very similar if I was to design a cube specifically for team draft, where I wanted the zero-sum nature of team drafting to be relevant. So maybe there's a potential style of cube list out there that is meant for playing with 6 people, be it drafted or sealed, that has some of these design considerations baked in.
We should also say that some people just really don't like that potential hate drafting aspect, so some people will do team drafting, but actually assign the teams afterwards, so you really can't think about hate drafting at all, which I kind of like the dynamic, especially of the table talk of knowing who's on your team and telling them not to screw up and all that, but if you're not into that and you're maybe more into avoiding the risk of people leaking information or something like that, you can also just assign teams randomly afterwards.
We did a team draft of my cube last week, and it was, a late night, members only in the local game store situation, and I was, first pack, I was just like, hey, teammates, nope, don't pass Uro. This is what I just said out loud.
This was quite a thing.
I said out loud, don't pass Uro if you see it, because you're not allowed to collude with your teammates, but it was out loud, so everyone knew. So
yeah,
and then the person on the opponent's team who was passing to me and had the pack in their hand said, "So I guess I should take Uro," and then I didn't get the Uro, and they would have passed it apparently.
It's true. Actually your teammate passed it first, so if you had said
that's not
if
true.
you had said that 15 seconds
no,
earlier,
that's not true.
Was it the first pack?
It was literally
Okay.
the first pack.
Okay.
We were looking at the first pack. I said,
Amazing.
"Don't pass Uro," and my opponent passed it to me. Said, "Okay," and then took it.
Yeah, I mean, but just think about that
Sad.
particular draft. That draft actually went to, we were exactly tied for match wins in going into the very last match and then going into game 3 of the last match. So that is another fun thing where you just stay invested. Everybody's sitting around cheering on their teammate, thinking about all the details of their decision because everything rides on that one last game.
Yeah, that was really fun.
And we won. By we, I mean me. It was great.
Yeah, I don't remember. I'm invested in the outcome in the moment, but I'm not after the fact.
It's fine.
Basically,
You
ever.
crushed us last night. Should we go down to 4 players?
Yeah, I think this is one of the hardest spots to figure out what the best way to draft a cube is.
It's definitely a big change. I think, the difference between 8 and 6, there are a lot of ways you can really optimize it, but it's still a pretty solid group. But when you get on to 4, it's a very different dynamic.
Do you have a favorite 4-player draft format before we dive into all the myriad options?
So one of the things that we get to do in Cube, because we're not opening sealed booster packs compared to actual limited, is we just get to change up the way things work. And obviously we can do really crazy stuff, like we're going to talk about grid drafts and houseman drafts, but we can do
crazy dude,
crazy
chill out.
stuff. But we can also just do something as simple as just change the pack size. And so my favorite way to play with 4 players is actually just to do a normal draft, but adjust the pack size to 4 packs of 11 or 5 packs of 9. I think either of those works pretty well, and you still get to have a fun draft.
I like 5x9 of the two, but I agree. This is, I think, a very easy way to change minimal things and play a reasonable draft. There are compromises to that. The total card pool is a lot smaller. It's half the size with a 4-player draft compared to an 8-player draft, which means that some of the things you may have included in your cube that's designed for playing with 8 players are now going to be kind of under-supported in a smaller draft format. the thing that I hear comes up a lot with a lot of players' cubes is just that aggro becomes a bit of a trap because you can no longer get that density of cheap threats that other decks don't want because they weren't even opened. And so even if you got all the white cards that were opened at your table, you're not going to have enough to make that mono white, aggro deck work as you would in a full table. Obviously, this entirely depends on the archetypes you have in your own cube, but any deck that requires a density of a particular type effect to function, I think the most basic example of that is an aggro deck. Those decks are going to get worse when you're drafting from a smaller pool.
Yeah, and I think that it can be a feature or a bug depending on how you're looking at it. If
right.
everybody's just on board of, hey, this is a new challenge, we are used to evaluating cards in the context of an 8-player draft, and now we're evaluating in a slightly different context, and the evaluations change, but you're still making meaningful choices from the range of options. I think you could, if you're doing this kind of draft often, just, iterate on the cube while playing it. I think is the easiest way to just tune an environment. We don't.
So someone casts a card and you say that card's cut from the cube right
exactly,
now because
at that moment
about to win the
banned
game
from the DCI. But no, I mean it's just as you're iterating. If you see aggro is suffering a little bit, and we keep doing it in this context of a 4-player draft, maybe just tune it up, and it'll work well if you're doing your tuning in the same against the same data of how you expect to be playing it.
I do think that as you get to fewer players, even if we take out the variable of how many cards you're drafting from, it's hard, I think, to have a really wide range of deck speeds, of archetypes when you have fewer players because there's just less room. There's less people to take the cards to put them in their deck. So it's hard for me to imagine even a cube that was designed to be drafted with 4 players having an all-in aggro deck and an all-in draw-go control deck and, some sort of really synergistic artifact deck or something without those just being the decks that get drafted every single time. Because if those things are present in the density to be required, then I think you're getting closer and closer to this when we draft, we just unshuffle the cube idea, which it just gets further from what people think of as a normal draft, I think.
Interesting. I don't know if I totally buy that, but I think that's worth thinking about because you have fewer decks, so it's not like you're just drafting 8 of these possible things that have such a wide bell curve. You're going to sort of collapse into a more narrow sort of segment of the possible themes, I guess.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is when I think about my cube, I will try to avoid including cards that only go in one deck, right? That's something that I do sometimes. To me, the board wipe deck is kind of one deck. It's got a lot of different flavors, but if you're committing to playing a lot of board wipes, you're some form of a control deck. But for the most part, I want my cards to be flexible and played in multiple archetypes or themes or whatever. And so I probably have in my head, let's say 12 to 13 decks that are possible in my cube at any given draft, 8 of which are drafted by people because that's the size of the pod. Look at me assuming the default. And I ideally don't want cards in the pool that only one player at the table wants at all, right? So when I think about putting a card in my cube, it's all right, well, here's Ragavan. Ragavan is excellent for the red aggressive decks. It's A+ there. It's really, really good for the red mid-range decks. It's probably even fine for the red control decks, right? It has this kind of curve of how much each deck wants that kind of effect. And when you only have 4 decks to choose from, it's harder to have multiple decks that want the card without all those decks kind of congealing into one similar mass, which is not a negative thing at all. I think a lot of people love quote-unquote mid-range only cubes where everyone's playing a similar curve, everyone's playing threats and answers, and you have to constantly reevaluate who's the proactive deck and who's the defensive deck at all times. But I do think that kind of gameplay is much better suited to a smaller table than trying to really go all in on very different decks that have no overlapping cards they want.
Yeah, okay. I think you're selling me. So overall, I feel like these small drafts actually do work pretty well. Another feature I think that makes them work especially well is just the actual cube that you're choosing and playing with. I think that some people have an issue if they're taking, a classic MTGO vintage style cube or something like that, and they're trying to play it with a smaller group. The decks look really different, and so much of cube design and game design is just meeting players' expectations in the right way. And when you play a deck that is drafted with a smaller group and is a quote-unquote worse deck, even if it's still paired just as well against the rest of the field, it feels worse if you have this expectation about what a deck from that cube should look like.
Right. If you're thinking, I drafted the Splinter Twin deck, then your Splinter Twin deck is going to be worse in a 4-player pod than an 8-player pod.
Right. But I've had a lot of fun with my main cube, regular cube, which is just much lower power. It's got a lot of... It's a very different cube that people don't necessarily have very strong expectations about what a good deck looks like. So when we draft with 4 players, you see more easily just how your deck looks against the field rather than against a deck from an 8-player draft. So I think actually starting with something that's a little bit more novel, a little more off the beaten path, works really well for this kind of smaller group and a lot of the other small group drafts that we're going to talk about.
Right, because players come in without an idea of what a good deck looks like, which means that they're going to draft their deck and think this is a good deck, right?
And if they win, they will agree with that.
Whereas even if you do draft a good deck from a cube that you are familiar with the 8-player archetypes in, it will not be as good as the 8-player version of that deck. And so even if you draft a great deck, you're still not going to be like, woohoo, I did it, because you're going to feel like you just barely got there, right? Because you're playing with a smaller group. There are a lot of other draft formats that I think are viable here. I don't think 4 players is like 6 players where there's an obvious winner and it's not even worth discussing alternatives, because there's a lot of other ways you can draft with 4 players and none of them are clear winners for me. A lot of people like burn draft formats. There's a variety of these. We're not going to go over all of them in detail because they all just are slight differences of numbers or pack counts or card counts or whatever. The way a burn draft works, though, fundamentally, is that you're going to have a pack size, and out of every pack, you're going to pick cards and burn cards, meaning remove them from the pack so they're not in your pool, but they're also not going to be in your opponent's pool. And you do that in some combination, right? Sometimes it's like pick 1, burn 1 for every single pick. Sometimes it's the first 3 picks are pick 1, then it becomes, pick 2, burn 1. There's all kinds of different, options for how this can possibly work.
Or it could be you're starting with a full pack, you're just picking until there's 4 or, some number
you're
of cards.
You're just burning the last 5
and,
cards in the pack or whatever. Like, there's all kinds of different ways you can do it. So what people are trying to accomplish with this, right, is they're trying to avoid the problems we were just talking about around how I'm not going to see the density of aggressive 1-drops to make my aggro deck work. I'm not going to see my other combo piece to make my Splinter Twin deck work. They're trying to get around that by basically saying you're going to see them all, and you can just burn the cards that you don't want to have to play with, or, burn cards so you're not ending up with a giant pool, but you're still getting to pick from a larger selection of cards to build your deck.
Right,
which on paper works and makes sense.
Right. Another use case for this that comes up a lot is a lot of players will have specific 2-card combos that they want to come up in their drafts. And if you're only drafting half the cube because you only have half the players, it is likely that you won't see both halves. But if you say, we're going to draft every single card in the cube, but half of them are going to get burned at some point during the draft, there's still the theoretical possibility that everything can be seen. I don't know how well that pans out, especially if you're doing burns within the actual picks, because players can really easily just burn those combo pieces that they see if they don't necessarily want to play against them.
Well, I think it's actually more relevant to more people to say that, there's not necessarily 2-card combos in a lot of cubes. A lot of people avoid that in their cubes. They just don't want 2-card combos to dominate things. But almost everybody has these A-B synergies in their cube, right? So if it's not Splinter Twin, think about having your enter the battlefield trigger creatures and your various blink effects, your soul herders, your ephemerates, your whatever. You're just going to see less of those things, right? And if your deck needs a certain density of both A and B to really function, then the burn draft is the thing that kind of starts to allow you to see that bigger card pool and actually get the kind of deck you want.
True.
I think it's harder. Yes, if I'm in a burn draft, am I just going to burn one half of Dark Depths combo or one half of Splinter Twin? Probably, because it's very low cost for me, and that's a really high ceiling if someone actually gets to put that together. Whereas, am I going to burn every single Blink spell just because I'm committed to cutting whatever player's playing Blink? Maybe, but it's a lot harder to actually totally cut off that option, I think, in a burn draft. I will say that I don't love burn drafts. I think you agree with me on this. I think they're on paper a good solution to this theoretical problem. You do get to draft from a bigger pool of cards. I think the decision of what to burn is not fun. It's not fun for the whole table in the sense that you're going to be burning the other good cards, the cards that are powerful and appealing that you probably put in your cube because you wanted people to play and win games with, because we've talked endlessly on this podcast about how you should make the fun thing the good thing. So your power outliers should also be fun, and now they're being burned because that's the correct thing to do, is burn the cards. There's also all kinds of weird metagaming. For example, I mentioned I'm probably not going to just cut the Blink player, but actually I probably am in a burn draft. I oftentimes decide I'm going to specifically leave this one deck open for the first pack, and then I'm going to cut it so hard and burn it out in the second 2 packs in the hopes that I trick somebody into picking cards for that deck and then me totally cutting them off. Now, draft is a game, so this is a game that you could play back and forth. You could do this metagaming with your opponents where if you know that I'm going to try and do that trick that I'm going to try and do, then you can draft with that knowledge, and there's still a lot of interesting strategy to be had there, but I think it devolves to a place where you are essentially trying to optimize for your opponent's deck being bad instead of your deck being good, and that's not that much fun. You end up playing the worst half of your cube, I think, when you're doing a burn draft. Yeah,
totally. I agree with all of that. I mean, I think just even at its most fundamental level, just saying, I don't personally find burning cards to be fun. And we were talking again specifically about the formats where you're not burning just the ends of the packs, but doing a pick one.
Yeah,
burn
we have to choose what you're burning, yeah.
And it's really fun to say, oh, cool, I opened this card that's going to be great for my deck. It's not fun for me to then follow that up with, and I have to figure out something else here, which doesn't directly impact my deck, but maybe impact something further down the line, which I can't really evaluate or make, informed decisions about in the future because it's going to be really subtle how it affects the rest of the table. It's just such a long, complicated sort of tree of logic that I'm just not as interested in that.
And I found that when we have done burn drafts, which we almost never do anymore because you and I don't love them.
We kind of settled on that, yeah.
But back when we used to do them more, I noticed that the strategy with which people would burn cards was wildly different from player to player.
That's another point.
Some players would just pick a color and say, I'm going to burn all the white. Some players would burn what they perceived to be the best cards in the pack. Some players would burn the cards they didn't want to play against in their own deck for whatever reason.
That's a pretty common one.
So,
I'm drafting a creature deck. I'm going to
burn all the
rats.
removal.
Yeah.
There's no more removal anymore. Sorry, it's all gone. And if you follow any one of these motivations and see it through to its logical conclusion, I think you end up at a place where you're drafting kind of unfun decks, has been my experience. So not to, yuck anybody's yum. If you're out there and you have a playgroup and you love your burn drafts, then by all means, you should do it. And if you haven't ever tried it, I recommend trying it because maybe it is going to be something that works for you, even though it doesn't work for Anthony and I. But those are my observations around the various burn draft formats.
For sure.
I have a way I really like to do 4-player drafts, which I get the sense that most other people don't love as much as I do. If I was always drafting with 4 Andys, let's just say we would always have, just like we have a go-to draft for 6 players, it's team draft, we would have a go-to draft for 4 players. And that is...
I'm just imagining the draft of 4 Andys and you all going into the tank on pick 7 of pack 3 and just the...
Trying to figure... Is that what I do? Pick 7 of pack 3? Ryan Spain, former co-host of Limited Resources, came up with a draft format for 4 players designed for retail limited, so over-the-counter boosters, that he calls Double Decker. And in that format, basically, you are drafting as normal, except you are drafting 2 decks at your seat. So you get 2 picks out of every pack, and then at the end of the draft, you have to build 2 decks with all the cards you have in your pool. And then when you go to the matches, this is the part I really like, you get paired up with an opponent, you choose deck A to play, they choose their deck A. Then after that, in game 2, you both play deck B. If you go to game 3, you get to choose, secretly before your opponent knows what you're choosing. You each simultaneously choose what deck your opponent is going to play, which then kind of encourages your opponent not to dump all of their eggs into one really good deck and have one deck that's being dragged along because they don't get to play that good deck in 2 of the 3 games if they go to game 3. I think this is cool and fun. I've done it before with cubes. I think it's great. I've also done it before with Retail Limited once or twice, and I think it's really fun. Some players find it overwhelming to drafting
2 decks at once is really hard. It's a lot to keep track of.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just that I think one of my flaws as a player is I don't think that hard about my draft decisions. I notice I am always the first person to take a card out of a pack, basically, no matter what draft it is.
This is a great format for people that just need a lot more stimulation.
Yeah, maybe. So I don't find it difficult. I think it's actually really fun, and maybe that's just because I think about cubes too much and whatever, but it's an interesting format. I will say that I think Ryan Spain's design has a fundamental flaw, which is that if you are just taking cards out of every pack, you get to build 2 decks at the end from the pool of cards you took, you can kind of just take cards in almost any color. I mean, if you're going to play 2 2-color decks, you can cover 4 of the 5 colors at your seat.
Building one shared pool.
Right.
There is still that motivation you mentioned of not having a good deck and a bad deck, but yeah, I totally see what you're saying.
What I mean is that I think a lot of the draft signals and the interest in drafting is removed, and it really just comes down to card evaluation. Can you identify from these 15 cards what the 2 best cards are, and then put them in your pile, and then figure out later on how you're going to combine those things to make 2 powerful decks. So I have a variation that I worked on that adds more complexity, but I think is really fun. And basically, you do the same thing, except you end up drafting 2 decks at the table in a way that you are virtually across from yourself. So instead of taking 2 cards out of every pack and then having one pool at the end to build 2 decks from, you are moving back and forth. A pick goes to deck A, a pick goes to deck B, a pick goes to deck A, a pick goes to deck B. That part's pretty simple, right? You're going to alternate decks, and some people maybe find that overwhelming even more so than drafting 2 decks out of sort of one big pool. But
simple, but definitely a lot to keep track of. You might want to have some dice at hand and move that die between the 2 stacks and make sure you're managing everything correctly.
Where it gets extra complicated, but is the thing I introduced, is because if you do that, imagine you're at a table with 4 players, and you alternate deck A, deck B, deck A, deck B. What you're actually doing is you're drafting at 2 different 4-player tables, right?
Right, because that pack comes around that you first picked from, and it's going to land on deck A again, right?
Yes. You are never going to be taking a card for deck B out of a pack you took a card from deck A from, and that's true of all the packs.
So maybe just drafting double queuing is just actually what you're looking for. That's the experience that you want.
No, because what I do when I do this is I introduce a 5th pack into every round, and that 5th pack is just full of basic lands. And I put it in between 2 players to start and say to the player, to the left of it, when you're done, pick up that pack instead of waiting for your opponent to pass one. And basically, whenever you get the basic land pack, you just put that basic land into whatever deck you're picking for.
You just draft a basic land of your choice.
You just draft a basic land. You draft a basic land, and it goes into your pool for the deck you were picking for, which means that essentially that cycle gets off by 1, which means that you are actually, if you lay it out on a piece of paper and figure it all out,
prime numbers, cryptography, it all comes back around.
But if you lay it all, it does really mean that you are going to take a card from pack A, and then 3 decks are going to get a pick from it, and then your second deck is going to get a pick from it, then 3 more decks are going to pick from it, then you're going to get a pick from it again with your other deck A. So it really is being across the table from yourself, which means that you can't send signals to yourself. You can, if you are really hyper attentive and you really pay attention, then you get a little more information, obviously, about what the 3 decks in between you and other you are doing. But I don't ever go that deep. I'm just thinking about, here's a pack in front of me, here's the deck I'm drafting for, what's the pick for this particular deck. And I think it's really fun to then have those 2 decks at the end of the draft and play games with them. Some people find it to be very overwhelming, so, your mileage may vary.
And the pack of basic lands sounds a little weird, but what it does is it just is a prop to keep everybody not having to change what their process is. You're still just, here's a pack, I take a card, put it in the pile, and then switch which pile I'm at.
Yes.
It just makes everything work much more smoothly than having to keep track of, oh yeah, I'm skipping this pick, or even, I'm picking up the pen that's marking this empty space.
The original idea we had was a totem, we'll pass, a dice or a Rubik's Cube around the table in between 2 packs, and when you get the Rubik's Cube, then you skip a pick, and that was way more complicated.
To keep track of which pack is, So I think, did I come up with the idea for the pack of lands? I think I want to give myself credit for that.
Sure.
Collaboration.
Sure, let's give it to you. I thought I came up with it because I thought you hated this format anyway, but it's fine.
I don't hate it. It's just, it's twice as much Magic as I want most of the time.
So I really like that for 4-player drafts. It's Andy editing from My Future, Your Past to tell you that I did take the opportunity to write down the rules for this draft format because of this episode. It does feel really complicated when you write down all the details, but if you just trust me and trust that it works, I don't think it's too complicated in practice. I gave it the name Wimbledon Draft, and I would love some feedback on it if you end up trying it in your own playgroup. I think that kind of covers the normal, meant for 8-player draft formats being scaled down to 4-player draft formats, right? It's either you change the pack size, you do burn drafts, you draft 2 decks at once. Is there some other option that is about scaling down 8-player drafts to 4 players?
I mean, we already talked about sealed a little bit, and I think that kind of scaling works the same way. You could do a double team sealed where you just have pick a number that you think makes sense and adjust it based on your experience, but building 2 decks from one pool, I think, would often work for a lot of cubes as well.
The other kinds of drafts you can do for 4 players tend to be 2-player draft formats, or formats that were designed for 2-player drafts but scaled up to 4. So 4 is really where we have the most options because you can kind of do anything. And again, nothing is really a perfect fit except for my beautiful, complicated double-decker format where you're passing a pack of basic lands around.
One other thing that sort of straddles in between that is Two-Headed Giant is a really fun format for a lot of people that want still kind of not the politics of multiplayer, but to still have the collaborative experience of multiplayer. And a lot of these different draft formats, you can scale either up or down in different ways and just play Two-Headed Giant games, which I think is a great thing to do when you have 4 players.
I was going to mention Commander too. There's a lot of people with Commander cubes that are meant for 4 players. So for you, that's your default.
Oh yeah, great point.
That's
actually,
your default.
An increasing
cube
number
size.
of cube designers. We're talking about the most difficult spot, and they're like, "This is the normal spot." I don't know what you guys are talking about.
For sure. And also, I know some cube designers that have a cube designed for 8 people, and they just play it 4-player multiplayer when they have 4 people, and that works for them. Obviously, there's no commander, there's no additional mechanics. You're just building a deck and playing it in multiplayer format. I think card evaluation changes dramatically there because of the different context, but again, it's a different game, and it's totally fun if that's what you're into. So that's also an option that is really clean. Just draft in any one of the ways we talked about, and then just play a multiplayer game.
Totally.
But if you do get to the point where you're scaling up 2-player draft formats, again, we won't go over all of these in detail. You can scale up a grid draft to 4 players. You basically replace the row or the column that was taken after the pick, all except for the last person in the group. You can scale up houseman drafting really easily because you don't have to change anything. It takes longer to draft because everybody has to wait for everybody to pick, but you just have 4 people around the grid with a 5-card hand. Everybody makes their 3 exchanges in order. That's really nice to scale up. There's ways to scale up Winchester and whatever drafts. So you could do all these scaled up to their different 4-player variations. Honestly, I've never done a 4-player Houseman draft, but I think if I was to do another 4-player draft soon, that's what I want to try because I think it's potentially promising to just imagine scaling that up to 4 players.
Yeah, it seems like a very flexible format. There's, as Mark Rosewater likes to say about designing cards, there's a lot of knobs you can turn on that format. You can change the number of cards you have in your hand, the number of players, the number of cards you have available on the table, the number of different tableaus, as we're now calling them, that you get to iterate through.
So how big the tableau is.
It seems very flexible in that sense.
And I don't even know that you would even need to change anything. Like, I think it's 9-card tableau. We should mention what Houseman Draft is. Again, it's easy to read about all this, but Houseman Draft is basically a format where each player gets a 5-card hand at random from the cube. 9 cards at random are put on the table in between the players, and you alternate exchanging 1 card in your hand with 1 card on the table until you've done that 3 times. Then the 5 cards you're left with go into your pool. You do that 9 times, you have a normal size pool of 45 cards, you build your deck from it. It's a very cool half public, half private information draft format where your opponent can see what you're taking and what you're putting back, but they don't see the really powerful cards that you open in your pack that never saw the table, and you just kind of keep those a secret. So it's kind of fun to do that. I think it scales up great to 4 players. I'd love to try it sometime. Maybe we'll do that if we end up with a 12-player cube night. So we tend to do 2-team drafts if that's the case. Other than that, I would say that I think for me, if you are like trying to decide what to do for 4 players and between all these options, I would lean towards the bigger draft formats scaled down than scaling up a grid draft or whatever, because I think those are extra complicated for people that have never done them before, as opposed to saying, yeah, we're just going to do I think a burn draft is a much easier leap for somebody that has never done any one of these novel draft formats than trying to explain Winchester drafting, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important piece of thought there, that just the context matters. You know, if you have a weird number for your local group, just throwing something totally new at a bunch of players might not be the easiest way to keep them engaged. You know, figure out what's working for everybody, and if they are comfortable doing grid and Houseman and Winchester, whatever makes sense to them, go for it. Otherwise, thinking of what is the smallest leap to get to something that works given the context that they're most comfortable with.
Yeah.
Another thing you can do, obviously, with these 2-player drafts is just do 2 in parallel, and then whether you're playing games actually just within your 2 pairs or crossing the pairs, you can obviously do that.
That's a great point. I forgot about that one
as well.
But yeah, you can take any 2-player draft format and just do 2 of them with your 4 players.
Yep.
And technically, if you're like trying to hold very firmly to like the game design principles, you could argue that playing with somebody that drafted from a totally different pool is like not that fair, but it's totally gonna come out in the wash. I think it's totally fine to play your deck you Houseman drafted in one pod against player A against player C, who it was playing in a different pod or different pair.
Or alternatively, I think that doing the sort of 2 pairs method works really well with Two-Headed Giant, because it takes out that issue there.
Yeah. And then there were 2, Anthony. I think there's a lot of great 2-player draft formats. This is the area where we see, dare I say, the most innovation in draft formats, because a lot of people can find one other person to draft with, and there's been a lot of time and effort spent into thinking of ways to do this. I'll just say that I think my preferred way to do this is either grid or Houseman drafting, depending on how I'm feeling. Again, these are all written about on our website. It's so much easier to follow them there. Some people love quilt drafts. Some people love Winchester drafts. Some people love Winston draft. There's all different kinds of ways you can do it. And I want the takeaway to be, if you're listening to this, I've never done a 2-player draft format, just that it's really fun. It's like, it is not baby Magic. It's real Magic, and it's a really fun way to play Magic, to draft a deck with just 2 people.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you really want to be spiky about it, there is a lot of room in these 2-player formats to figure out the nuances of hate drafting and playing this zero-sum game that you really can test your sort of gameplay skills in these draft formats.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite 2-player draft format?
Yeah, I mean, for me, grid draft is pretty far and ahead the winner. I just really like that. Basically, the way it works is you're laying out sets of 9 cards and then choosing rows or columns from them and going back and forth. And players do get to pick from a grid that you've already chosen from. So there is a little bit of hate drafting involved there. And I just think that, it has a nice sort of consistent rhythm to it. You're always making decisions based on a similar number of cards.
You get to make fun decisions.
And you make fun decisions and trying to optimize, well, there's 2 really powerful cards. Do I want to, which of those is the best? And then how do I angle my grid pick in order to optimize getting the second best card, or potentially getting one that's really good for me while hating a powerful card for my opponent? And it just injects a lot of interesting variation into the draft, because you do end up, I picked up this card incidentally in a color I wasn't thinking about playing, but now maybe there's something else that comes up that makes it interesting. And those kinds of choices that, based on what you've drafted before, change the way you're making future decisions, that's what makes drafting really fun and interesting.
I think those decisions are what's the most fun about grid draft by far. It is really fun to think about which row or column do I want here, as opposed to just saying what's the best card in a pack for my deck.
Yeah.
I mean, I love drafting of all kinds, so I still love the what's the best card in this pack for my deck decisions anyway, but this extra layer, there's only 6 options, right? When you look at the pack, you have 3 rows, 3 columns, so you're only deciding between 6 things, which means it's not overwhelming, but there is a lot of nuance which of those 6 decisions you make, which of those 6 choices you make. And then if you go second, you have 5 choices because one of them's already taken.
Yeah, that balance to me is really nice. Where
it's a really good balance.
And because I think some of the issue I have or challenge I have with things like Winston or Winchester draft, where you're creating packs and the packs are growing as the draft goes until somebody picks them, it does mean that you're not making a series of similarly sized decisions. There's kind of these weird forces that change over time, and eventually it's like, okay, well, this
does
pack
feel a
just
lot more
has
chaotic.
So many different, so many cards in it. This becomes increasingly the right choice, and if those choices are fun for you, by all means, again, like everything, but to me,
our subjective bias here, like, just try a bunch of these, like whichever one appeals to you. Everybody has their preferred one. I'm not invested in which one you do, listener. Like, do whatever works for you, but know that there are a bunch of options, and a lot of them are really fun.
Totally.
I do want to mention all of Ryan Overturf's work here on his Tubert concept. So Ryan, during the peak of the pandemic and quarantine, spent some time designing cubes specifically designed for drafting with 2-player called Tuberts. And I think Ryan's written a lot of really interesting things about the concepts behind these cubes. I think the lists are really interesting. I don't love the name Tubert. I know you're in the same category as me here. I think it just introduces confusion to be like, this is not a cube, it's a tubert. And when someone says, oh, do I want to play a tubert? Do I want to play a cube? What does that mean? Does it play differently? So I like just thinking about it as small cubes, right? It's another kind of small cube. You can make a small cube of any size that you want. And the tubert as a concept is great. Again, I like everything Ryan's written about this concept. I just don't love the name.
Yeah, I mean, the core idea there is, hey, if we're doing consistently just 4-player drafts, we're only using half the cube, don't build the cube bigger than you need it to be. And this is, I think, especially useful because it's where we point a lot of people that are interested in getting into Cube is if you're getting into Cube, you're growing a playgroup at the same time, you likely are starting with a small group. Just start with a small list as well, because it's going to be easier to put it together, and it's inevitably easier to grow the list than it is to cut a list down. So yeah, only make the cube as big as you need to start with for the number of people you have, and you can always make it bigger.
And there's more to it than that, right? Like, Ryan has put a lot of thought into how do you think about the fact that you are going to have less archetypal diversity when you have 2 players. Everyone's playing kind of the same game. How do you make card choices that make sense there? One decision Ryan made, which I like a lot, is making the fixing lands all just 2-color lands, like none of this fetch nonsense, basically, because it's easy sometimes in these draft formats where you get to see a big pool of cards and you're burning some other number of them to make your mana kind of perfect, which means that sometimes playing 3 or 4 colors is a free addition, and so constraining the mana a little bit to try and make it so you're motivated to play 2 colors with low decisions, I think, is very reasonable. And just to be clear, like, it's not that I don't like the name Tuber. I don't like the fact that this is presented as if it were a different thing from just playing a small cube.
Yeah, totally.
I also don't like the article title, which is the proper way to 2-player draft, which, to be fair, Ryan might not have even written.
Probably the editor's choice.
Yeah, I mean, I know in a lot of editorial situations, the author has no control over what the actual title is, but that's there is no proper way. Everyone's got their own way to do it. But I do think it's interesting that Ryan has spent so much time looking at the ways in which card choices and design decisions change in a 2-player draft format, because not a lot of people have, and it is different, right? You iterate on your cube, right? You draft it with some people, you ask them what they thought was good, what they thought was bad, you hear their complaints, you play your own pool, you get some sense of what cards are working or not working. All of that is based on the context of your 8-player draft you just did, or whatever. If you play 2 players all the time, and I had a period where I was playing my cube with 2 players a bunch, and I started to feel like, oh, these are cards that I would totally cut if I didn't want to draft this with 8 players, or these other cards I would add. It's just a whole different world when you're doing these different kinds of smaller draft formats. I do think one variable to be conscious of is just how dissimilar different draft formats are from an 8-player draft. So the thing that I like most about Houseman drafting, which is my other preferred way to 2-player draft, is that I have found on power level, the decks do pretty closely resemble the power level decks you get from an 8-player draft. There are other contingencies, right? Like, just like other formats, all the fixing can be snapped up, and you're going to see, I think, mathematically, like half the cube. So you're going to get a ton of fixing no matter what your deck is doing, which has, trade-offs. So I'd probably change the fixing density or the fixing types if I was going to Houseman draft my cube all the time. But if I'm trying to play my cube in a way that will hopefully inform card evaluation for an 8-player draft, if I'm looking at it in that context, I like that over certainly like a Winston draft, where the decks, I think, are way different than they are in an 8-player draft. And it's a different game. It could be totally fun as a separate game unto itself. Like you said, trying to contextualize this with your players as not we're playing bad versions of decks that are designed for 8 players, but instead we're drafting new kinds of decks is relevant. But it's just good to be aware, I think, of how different these formats are from actual 8-player drafts.
Yeah, I mean, you can also, rather than trying to think very hard about how things change, you can always just do the actual testing and be informed by real experience. If you're playing your cube grid draft a lot, that's like the main way you're going to do it. If you just make changes to your cube,
Right.
say like this card feels over-supported or under-supported or overpowered or underpowered, and make cuts and additions based on that play experience, it'll end up over time being tailored towards that experience. And if you change the way it's drafted, it's going to be a little bit different, but just be cognizant of like when you're making decisions, where is the data that you're using to inform those decisions coming from? And if it is the same context that you're mostly playing it, you're going to be in great shape.
All of the abstract cube design stuff we've ever talked about in this show, I think, applies no matter what format you're drafting your cube in. It's just that changes a little bit what your inputs are to your decision-making system. What evaluations you make based on gameplay are going to be informed by the way you're drafting it, but that's all a self-contained system, right? It doesn't matter how your cube plays relative to some other cube. All that matters is how it plays relative to how you're drafting it.
Absolutely. Should we go even further? One player cube.
No, we shouldn't.
You can do a supreme draft. Draft your entire cube one pack at a time. Pack ones, pick ones, or pack 2 picks at a time. Only pack ones.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, I don't know. Supreme draft. Go look it up. It's fun, I guess.
I thought the idea of Supreme Draft on MTGO is that it was always from a full pack.
That is how it works.
So you can't do it with a
MTGO.
cube and paper.
Yeah, you can make it work.
If you make duplicate proxies of all the good cards, I guess.
mean, you could still just take a pack of 15, take your favorite card, take a new pack of 15, do that. Again, one player cube. Doesn't matter.
I think much more relevant to our listeners, Anthony, is what to do when you have odd numbers of people. So we talked about
That is the trickiest part.
We talked about what to do with these various even numbers of people. We didn't talk about it, but if you have more than 8, congratulations, you did it. You don't need any of this advice. If you have 10, your cube supports 10, go for it. Otherwise, you're looking at 6 and 4, or 6 and 6 at 12, or you can do these in any combination, basically, if you have more than 8, based on the cube you have on hand and how many cards it's got in it.
Yeah, I mean, you could extend the same logic to a 10-player, again, if you expect to have a group like that, sure, make your cube a little bit bigger to support that, and you could extend the logic and say, let's do a 5v5 team draft. That could work, or you'll have some of the same difficulty with pairings compared to, a 6 and a 10, but I feel like the bigger you get, the less those become an issue, because you're more likely to have match outcomes that make sense. Is that true?
Well, there's never going to be multiple people that are paired up or down, because then they would just be playing each other.
Right.
You're only going to have one paired up or down match each round.
So the number
even if you have
of less than ideal pairings goes down.
Well, the number stays the same, but the overall people goes up. So the relative number of less ideal pairings goes down.
My favorite way to think of numbers.
Exactly. So odd numbers. I think 7 is a bummer, but I think you just do an 8-player draft format, and
you're still
somebody
playing
has a bye.
cube with your friends, so it's not that bad.
Right, it's a relative bummer. I still think you just do an 8-player draft format and have someone have a bye. Would you do anything different for 7 players than 8 players?
No, I think that makes perfect sense. Have somebody, facilitate, comment on matches, make sure everybody's got snacks and drinks, whatever you need to keep the cube night fun, or just, sit around and heckle people.
5. I think 5 is the most cursed number, personally.
5 is the most cursed number. Again, you're getting more people that are not actively able to play in 2-player matches in proportion to the whole group, which is not ideal.
So that's a bummer. For 5, I think you should be looking at doing one of the 4-player draft formats. And again, there's a million options there, whether it's a scaled down 8-player draft format or a scaled up 2-player draft format. Think about doing that with 5, and then, again, just having someone have the bye, basically.
Yeah,
the advantage
I agree.
when your numbers this small is that there's no rounds, right? As soon as one match is finished, the person that had the bye jumps in and plays whoever won, and you just kind of fluidly move around and keep playing games, because the idea that there's any hierarchy or tournament tree is totally obliterated when you're down to that few people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think my favorite is, again, 5 packs of 11 or some combination of pack sizes like that for 5 players. It tends to work out pretty well.
Anthony means 4 packs of 11, but I'll put in a vote here for 5 packs of 9. Still 45 cards, and you're still going to see roughly the same number of cards on the wheel as you would with a 15-card pack and an 8-card pod. That's how we get these seemingly random numbers for pack sizes, is just trying to keep it so you don't wheel one pack around the table a bunch of times. You still just see a pack, more or less twice. I do want to mention one archaic, strange format of Magic that I have done a couple times, which I think is very interesting.
I was hoping you would.
Star Magic? Is that what you're talking about?
Let's talk about Star Magic. The one thing you can do uniquely when you have 5 people.
Yeah, if you really think 5 is too cursed and you want to do something weird, Star Magic is a format that is a 5-player multiplayer game, which I know sounds awful right off the bat. For anybody that's played a 5-player Commander game or a 6-player Commander game, it just takes so long and so much time is not you making decisions. It's totally awful and a huge slog. The way this 5-player format works is it's multiplayer. Your win condition is that the 2 players opposite from you lose the game. That means you win, which means that each of your opponents sitting to your left and right are half your ally, half your enemy, right? They have a mutual enemy. They also want somebody on the other table to be dead, but they have somebody else that they want dead that you want to keep alive explicitly because you don't want them to be one of the first ones to die because you don't want your opponent sitting to your other side to win. It creates some really interesting situations because of this weird, politicking. It is a political format. We do all these weird, wheels and deals and stuff to make things happen. But I think this is a novel thing to do, is to play Star Magic. I would draft normally. I would make it 40-card decks normally. I would draft whatever way you choose to draft for 5 players, whether that's just smaller packs or burning draft, whatever you want to do. And then just make normal 40-card decks and just play a game where, again, your win condition is that people across from you have lost the game.
Right, so it is a free-for-all melee-style game where players can attack any other players and block for themselves, but it just, there's that one additional rule of what your win condition is, which means you're only going to be realistically attacking the people across from you, but you could end up, pointing a removal spell at a creature that's attacking one of your opponents because it means saving your opponent means that somebody else doesn't immediately win the game, so it does add some interesting tension there.
Yeah, so it's not as totally. I think one of the problems with really big commander games is decision paralysis. I could attack 5 players. I'm in my 6-player pod. Who do I attack? It doesn't matter.
15 minutes and then decides, I guess I just won't attack.
Right, and so here a lot of those decisions are narrowed because of this extra restriction of your win condition, which I think is really interesting. I haven't done this enough to say this is a brilliant way to play games. I don't actually know. I've done it a couple times, kind of as a novelty, but it's out there. It's an option for you if you want to give it a shot. I think 3 players is actually not that bad. I find
okay.
To where 5 feels really cursed, 3 players feels nice because the person that has the bye is watching the match that they're about to play the winner or loser of, and that also means that there's absolutely no downtime between rounds or anything because there's always going to be 2 people that can play no matter what. So for 3 people, I like doing one of the 2-player draft formats that can scale up to 3 players, which is pretty straightforward, and then just flipping some coins or whatever to decide who's playing in the first match. What I usually do is take 3 basic lands where 2 are one type and the third is a third type, so 2 swamps and 1 island, hand them out secretly. Whoever's got the island has the bye. But you get to actually just watch and you're actually motivated to watch that match.
That person gets to sit on the island while the 2 people are playing.
Right. Whereas with the 5-person, do you pick one of the matches to watch? That feels a little weird unless you're really invested in one over the other. If one match ends, you can hop in, but then if the other match ends, maybe things get more awkward, I think, when there's 5 people. It feels more cursed to me. 3 feels like a nice little group, just doing a little draft.
I don't know if I totally buy that, but sure, yeah. I mean, I have enjoyed plenty of 3-player games of Magic or Knights of Cube. My favorite is definitely, again, Grid Draft. I think it does scale up pretty nicely. You also can, again, just play a multiplayer game with 3 players, though. My personal taste is a multiplayer game with 3 players is a lot closer, I think, to a 2-player game than 4 players, right?
I would say it's 50% closer.
50% closer. So I think that, if I'm to take my main cube that isn't necessarily designed with the expectation or with the sort of design experience and iteration of being played multiplayer, it still plays pretty okay with 3 players, maybe not so much with 4 players, but 3 players you can swing every once in a while.
Yeah. A lot of options. Anthony, I'm going horse over here talking about all the options we have for drafting with smaller groups of people. In terms of drafting, have we missed anything?
I'm sure we've missed a lot.
Well, we alluded to a bunch of stuff that you can go look up, but I think we covered the broad strokes of all these different options. Again, I think obviously 8, slam dunk. I think 6 is a slam dunk, 100%, just as good as having 8. I think that's totally great. 4 is kind of rough. I would say 4 is a 3 out of 5 in terms of having 8. I'm really happy at 2, too. I think 2 is a 4.5 out of 5. I love doing 2-player drafts. Then the odd numbers, they're all going to take a tick down for being odd numbers, but 3 is my favorite odd number group to have.
I mean, if you like 2 that much more than 4, then you can definitely just do 2 simultaneous 2-player drafts.
That's true, but sometimes other people are not into that, so.
Fair. Okay. Again, other people. Always getting in the way of your fun.
Other people always affecting my game. How dare they? In addition to drafting cubes, if you are specifically coming at this topic from the angle of hosting a cube night in the way we talked about in our last episode, there are other kinds of Magic that are cube adjacent in the sense that you bring a box of cards that is self-contained to the table and then 2 players can play with it that are not cube. We've talked about Battle Box before in this show. I think Battle Box is a great format for 2 players. It's also really nice to just have on hand because if you have 10 players for cube and you decide you really would rather do an 8 rather than a 6 and a 4, then those 2 players can just play a Battle Box if they prefer rather than doing a 2-player cube draft.
Yeah, Battle Box is great. I feel like if you're doing a Cube Night, have a Battle Box or two. It's just like it's so useful for also filling up some time if you want to get there early and get set up that I think it's almost an essential tool.
I also have alluded to these pre-constructed decks I've designed, which we got to talk about this in more length at some point, and I'm going to, I think, write about these when I feel like they're at a good spot. They're getting close. Designing these pre-constructed decks. So I have 5 decks, one of each monocolor, that are designed to
just for playing Star Magic.
No, they're designed to be played against each other one-on-one, and it was so much harder to design these decks than it has ever been to design a cube, because you lose that like balancing feature of drafting, right? Like there's going to be a power band in the draft, but you rely on your players to like level that out by taking the powerful cards first and the less powerful cards later, so that everybody on average ends up with the same rough amount of power. So much harder to think about trying to make even just 2 decks have a reasonable matchup, and then once you have 2 decks have a reasonable matchup, you introduce a third, and it's like, well, how did this triangle work? And getting all the way to 5 was really challenging. This has been like a multi-year project I've been working on with these monocolored decks to get to a point where I'm happy with them. So
I think even if you don't want to spend literal years fine-tuning a set of decks, just making your best effort to build a collection
steal
of
mine.
Just steal the list.
They're all cheap cards, steal them.
But just building sort of a collection of self-contained decks that are made to be played against each other is just a great thing to have on hand. I've actually heard this being termed as a battle box as well. There's a little bit of a confusion of terms, but it is just another fun way to play and a good resource to have if you're not sure what your Cube Night is going to look like exactly.
Anthony, we're now, I believe, the top Google search result for MTG Battle Box, so we get to decide what Battle Box is.
Well, okay, the other one is called Battle Box because this one is not.
Exactly.
I'm choosing that.
Yep.
Okay? What is this one called?
Dual
Magic the
decks.
Gathering.
I think dual decks is straightforward.
Sure, okay.
Because it implies they're meant to be played 2-player, and they're decks that come pre-constructed. And also, dual decks is a product Magic sold for a long time, so there's some precedent for that.
Sure. How do you spell dual decks?
DUEL?
Okay.
As opposed to DUAL?
Dueling decks, not 2 decks.
Yes.
Okay, got it. Sure.
Yes, dueling with swords and guns.
Swords and
Pew, pew, pew.
no creatures and magical spells. Excuse me.
Anthony, we went too long to do a pack one pick one again. We have to stop doing this.
You want to do it really fast?
But let's do it really fast. We're going to do a really fast pack one pick one here.
So we're going to break our rules and not use our randomized algorithm because we wanted to go through our list and find one of the first, the oldest submitted that is specifically designed for being played with a small group because we want to be topical.
That's what we're talking about.
So we're going to draft the Fast and Friendly Cube by Moon.
If I'm reading this draft format correctly on Cube Cobra, I believe we get to pick 3 cards out of the pack, and that's how this works for 4 players. So it's a cube designed for 4 players. You have full 15-card packs, but you take 3 picks at a time, which makes the draft go super fast because less passing of cards around. The pack is done after it goes around the table once.
Yeah, I appreciate that this cube has been designed specifically for a small group, and he's got all kinds of different draft formats laid out that you can even are pre-configured on Cube Cobra so you can see exactly what those look like.
So I'll read the pack, and then Anthony, you got to tell us what 3 cards you're taking. The pack is Surge Hacker Mech, Satyr Wayfinder, Perilous Voyage, Molten Blast, Strategic Planning, You Meet in a Tavern, Force Spike, Piercing Rays, Broken Wings, Kargan Intimidator, Ransack the Lab, Prohibit, Rakdos Headliner, Rune of Mortality, and Citadel Gate. I know my 3 right off the bat.
Oh, really? Your 3 are easy? So
Yeah.
I'm feeling a little bit torn between am I trying to, like, take a... my first reaction is let's take 3 in one color and just cut that off. But what if I do that and then I'm cut off from that color? I could be in a really bad spot, so I'm not sure. I feel like it'd be hard for me to pass Citadel Gate. This is... enters battlefield, tapped, you choose any color. It's basically an Evolving Wilds plus. So I feel like I'm definitely taking that to hedge against that risk. I'm a little bit interested in taking just like Prohibit and Force Spike and Strategic Planning. I think I'm just going to take this Gate and maybe Kargan Intimidator and Surge Hacker? What does this mech do?
It's like a vehicle tribal thing. It's
vehicle tribal
fine
thing? All right,
on
let's
its
take
own,
Kargan Intimidator and Strategic Planning. Stay a little bit open. I think that's going to be my strategy on quick notice.
I think power level wise, Kargan Intimidator is clearly the best card in the pack, and
Great.
so that's one I'm taking no matter what. I'm not that high on Citadel Gate because I'm looking at Kargan Intimidator and Rakdos Headliner, and I'm like, I am drafting an aggro deck.
That's
Just
fair.
try and stop me. So my picks are Kargan Intimidator, Rakdos Headliner, and Ransack the Lab. Which
Okay, I like that.
I like Ransack the Lab a lot. Give me a little card selection. Let me fix my mana when I don't take enough non-basic lands. I can, at least cast my Ransack the Lab and find the lands I need. But yeah, I think Kargan Intimidator, and honestly, Rakdos Headliner is kind of messed up.
It's a pretty cool
Especially
card.
if there's any reason to be discarding things, which I don't know from looking at this pack, but if there's any kind of madness or like Graveyard Matters stuff, which also pairs well with Ransack the Lab, then Rattrap's Headliner is really, really kind of a messed up card. All right, Moon, thank you for sending in your cube. I hope you are okay with the hyperspeed pick, considering it's a hyperspeed cube, and that's what we're going to take out of the pack. If you want to have your cube on Lucky Paper Radio, or at least get on the list to be on the show eventually, you can fill out the form on our website. All right, wrapping it up. I hope that we have helped dispel the notion that you have to have 8 people to draft a cube, given that we talked about other ways to do it for like an hour and 10 minutes. So hopefully that it gives enough clarity for you. Play all these formats and let us know what your favorite is. I know everybody out there has their favorites. So if you have a favorite, leave a comment on Reddit, the YouTube video, on Discord, Twitter, wherever you see this. Just leave a comment and tell us what your favorite small draft format is. And that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by Anthony and I, doing just tons and tons and tons of weirdly sized and shaped drafts over the years, and then telling you all the different ways you can draft your cube with any number of people.
Yeah, play Cube with all the people.
You checked out. You closed your computer and you went vacant. You were like, am I on a podcast? It's like you just woke
I
up.
thought it was over.